The first mortar round struck the village with a thunderous explosion that shook the entire valley. Maria watched through her scope as a mud brick building collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris. The Taliban were employing a devastating but risky tactic. They were willing to destroy their own positions if it meant eliminating the trapped Rangers. Incoming mortars. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio, barely audible over the sound of falling masonry. All units, take cover. Maria could see the Rangers scrambling for better protection as more mortar rounds began falling around their position. The Taliban gunners were walking their fire closer to the defensive perimeter with each shot, adjusting their aim based on the explosions. It was only a matter of minutes before they found the range and devastated the Rangers' position. Through her scope, Maria spotted the mortar team on a ridge about 800 meters to the east. They had set up their weapon in a natural depression that provided excellent concealment from air attack, but left them partially exposed to ground-level observation. She could see 3 men operating the mortar, one feeding rounds into the tube, one adjusting elevation, and one calling corrections based on where the rounds were landing. The range was at the very edge of her weapon's effective capability, and she would be shooting across a valley with unpredictable wind patterns. But the mortar team represented the greatest immediate threat to everyone in the valley, including herself. If they managed to adjust their fire onto her position, even her rocky cover wouldn't protect her from a direct hit. Maria loaded one of her remaining precious rounds and adjusted her scope for the extreme range. She would have to account for significant bullet drop over such a distance, as well as the crosswind that was gusting through the valley. The shot would require perfect technique and a significant amount of luck. She aimed for the fighter operating the mortar's elevation mechanism, reasoning that eliminating him would disrupt their fire mission even if she didn't hit the weapon itself. Through her scope, she could see the man clearly as he made fine adjustments to the mortar tube's angle. The Barrett roared, sending its massive projectile on a long arc across the valley. Maria watched through her scope as the round struck the rocks just behind the mortar position, sending stone fragments flying but missing her intended target. The 3 Taliban fighters dove for cover, temporarily abandoning their weapon. Mortar team is suppressed, but not eliminated, she reported while working the rifle's bolt. I need one more shot to finish them. But before she could reload, another crisis developed. The damaged extraction helicopter was losing altitude rapidly, trailing thick black smoke from its port engine. Dragonflight Lead was fighting to keep his aircraft airborne, but it was clear that he would have to attempt an emergency landing somewhere in the valley. Mayday, mayday, the pilot transmitted. Dragon Lead is going down. Engine failure, losing hydraulics. I'm going to try to put her down in the riverbed north of the village. Maria could see the helicopter through her binoculars, its rotor disc tilted at a dangerous angle as the pilot struggled to maintain control. If the Black Hawk crashed with its crew aboard, the rescue mission would become a recovery operation, and the Rangers would be left with no way out of the valley. The mortar team had recovered from her near miss and was already back at their weapon. Through her scope, Maria could see them loading another round into the tube. They had obviously identified the Rangers' position and were preparing to drop high-explosive death directly on top of them. She had to make a choice. Take another shot at the mortar team or shift her fire to the remaining machine gun position that was preventing the second helicopter from landing. Either decision could prove fatal to the Americans in the valley. The sound of the mortar firing made the decision for her. The hollow thump echoed across the valley, and Maria knew that Morrison and his men had less than 30 seconds before the round impacted. She swung her rifle toward the mortar position and fired without taking time to adjust for the precise range. The .50 caliber round struck the mortar tube itself, the massive bullet's kinetic energy sufficient to bend the heavy steel barrel like a pretzel. The weapon was instantly rendered useless, and the 3 Taliban fighters were thrown backward by the impact of secondary fragments. One mortar threat was eliminated, but Maria had no way of knowing if there were other indirect fire weapons positioned around the valley. The damaged helicopter was now descending rapidly toward the riverbed, its pilot performing a masterful auto-rotation that would either save his crew or kill them all. The aircraft hit the rocky ground hard, bouncing twice before sliding to a stop against a pile of boulders. Miraculously, the crew began climbing out immediately, apparently uninjured but now stranded in the valley with everyone else. Dragon lead is down but crew is intact, came the report from the second helicopter pilot. We now have 16 personnel requiring extraction from a hot landing zone. The tactical situation had become even more complicated. Not only did Maria need to clear the landing zone for the remaining helicopter, but now there were additional people to evacuate. The second Black Hawk couldn't carry 16 people in a single lift, which meant multiple trips through the deadly valley. Through her scope, Maria could see Taliban fighters moving toward the crashed helicopter. They had obviously realized that the crew represented valuable prisoners or propaganda opportunities. If they managed to capture American aircrew, the mission would become an international incident with far-reaching political consequences. Multiple hostiles approaching the crash site, she radioed. Dragon crew needs to establish a defensive perimeter immediately. The helicopter crew consisted of 4 men: the pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, and door gunner. They were trained infantry soldiers in addition to their aviation duties, but they were equipped with only their personal weapons and whatever ammunition they carried. Against dozens of Taliban fighters with heavy weapons, they wouldn't last long in a sustained firefight. Maria made another tactical decision that went against every principle of sniper employment. Instead of remaining in her concealed position and picking off individual targets, she began moving toward the crashed helicopter. The crew needed immediate support, and she was the only person in position to provide it. The rocky terrain that had provided excellent concealment for sniping became a nightmare for rapid movement. Maria had to scramble over loose shale and navigate around massive boulders while carrying her heavy rifle and equipment. Every step threatened to send her tumbling down the mountainside, but she pushed forward anyway. As she moved, Maria could hear intensifying gunfire from the direction of the crash site. The helicopter crew had indeed established a defensive perimeter, but they were clearly outgunned and outnumbered. She could also hear Morrison's Rangers engaging Taliban fighters who were attempting to overrun their position while most of the enemy force was distracted by the helicopter. The remaining machine gun position on the western ridge was still active, sending streams of fire toward anyone who moved in the valley. That gunner had to be eliminated before the second helicopter could attempt a landing, but Maria was now too far away to engage him effectively. Through her radio, she could hear the second helicopter pilot coordinating with ground forces for another extraction attempt. "This is Dragon 2. I need that western machine gun position neutralized before I can come in. My aircraft can't take the kind of damage that Dragon lead absorbed." "Working on it," Maria replied, though she wasn't sure how she was going to deliver on that promise. She was still several hundred meters from the crash site, and Taliban fighters were closing in from multiple directions. Then, she heard something that made her heart sink, the distinctive sound of another helicopter approaching from the east. But this wasn't the sound of American rotors. The deep thrum of the approaching aircraft's engines identified it as either Russian or Iranian-made, which could only mean that Taliban reinforcements were arriving by air. The enemy helicopter appeared over the eastern ridge, a Soviet-era Mi-17 transport that could carry 20 heavily armed fighters. Maria could see it through her binoculars as it began descending toward a flat area near the village. If those reinforcements, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Maria could see through her scope that Taliban fighters had managed to get within 50 meters of the Rangers' defensive position. Morrison and his men were now engaged in close-quarters combat, using their sidearms and whatever ammunition they had left. The sound of gunfire had intensified, becoming a constant roar that echoed off the valley walls. "Bravo 6, this is Viper 1, Maria transmitted while scanning for her next target. "I need you to mark your perimeter with anything you have. I'm going to start taking shots into the village, and I don't want any friendly fire incidents." "Copy that." Morrison's voice was tight with strain. "We're throwing green smoke on our north side. Everything beyond that is hostile." Through her scope, Maria watched as a green smoke grenade rolled out from behind the Rangers' position, creating a clearly visible boundary. The Taliban fighters were so close that some of them were actually silhouetted against the green smoke, making them perfect targets for her precision rifle. She shifted her aim to the closest group of enemy fighters, 3 men who were attempting to flank the Rangers from the east. The distance was only 300 meters, but they were moving fast and using cover effectively. Maria led the first target by several feet, accounting for his movement speed and direction. The Barrett roared again, and the lead Taliban fighter dropped immediately. His companions dove for cover behind a low stone wall, but Maria was already adjusting her aim. The second shot came 10 seconds later, punching through the stone barrier and dropping another enemy fighter. Multiple hostiles down in the village, she reported. But there are more coming up from the south. You've got a whole squad moving through the date palm grove. The extraction helicopters were still circling overhead, their pilots growing increasingly frustrated. Dragonflight Lead was an experienced combat pilot who had flown dozens of similar missions, but he had never encountered such concentrated enemy fire in such a confined space. Every time he tried to descend toward the landing zone, multiple weapons opened up on his aircraft. Viper 1, this is Dragon Lead. The pilot's voice came over the radio. I need those remaining machine gun positions neutralized before we can attempt extraction. My bird is taking hits, and I can't risk my crew much longer. Maria could see the problem clearly through her scope. The two remaining PCAM positions were perfectly positioned to cover the only suitable landing zone in the valley. The western machine gun nest was built into a natural rock formation that provided nearly complete protection, while the southern position was dug into the hillside with overhead cover that would deflect anything short of a direct artillery hit. But there was another problem that was becoming increasingly urgent. Maria's ammunition supply was running low. She had started the day with 20 rounds for the Barrett, and she had already fired 8. Each shot had to count, because she wouldn't get many more chances. The Taliban fighters in the village were regrouping, using the maze of buildings to coordinate their assault on the Rangers' position. Through her scope, Maria could see a group of fighters setting up an RPG team in what looked like the village mosque. If they managed to get that rocket launcher into action, they could destroy the Rangers' defensive position with a single well-placed shot. Maria made a quick decision. The RPG team posed the most immediate threat, even more dangerous than the machine gun positions. She shifted her aim toward the mosque, where she could see 3 men assembling the rocket launcher on the roof. The range was 425 meters, and the targets were partially concealed behind the mosque's low wall. Maria aimed for the fighter holding the RPG itself, knowing that destroying the weapon would be more effective than simply killing the operators. The Barrett's .50 caliber round could easily penetrate the RPG's thin metal casing and detonate the warhead inside. She squeezed the trigger, feeling the massive recoil drive her backward. Through her scope, she saw the devastating result of her shot. The .50 caliber round struck the RPG dead center, detonating the warhead in a brilliant flash that demolished a large section of the mosque's roof. All 3 Taliban fighters disappeared in the explosion, along with their weapon. Good hit on the RPG team, Morrison radioed. But we've got more problems. I count at least 20 fighters moving through the village from multiple directions. We can't cover all approaches with the ammo we have left. Maria could see the tactical situation clearly now. The Taliban had committed a large force to this ambush, far more than intelligence had suggested. They were using classic guerrilla tactics, allowing the Rangers to become engaged and, then, surrounding them with overwhelming numbers. It was a textbook operation that had worked countless times before against conventional forces. But the Taliban commanders had made one critical error in their planning. They had not anticipated the presence of a precision sniper who could reach out and touch them from nearly a kilometer away. Maria's Barrett rifle had already disrupted their carefully orchestrated attack, but there were still too many enemy fighters for her to engage them all. The extraction helicopters made another approach, this time coming in low and fast from the north. Dragonflight Lead was clearly frustrated with the delay and was willing to take greater risks to get his people out. But as soon as the Black Hawk dropped below the ridge line, both remaining machine gun positions opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked toward the helicopter like deadly fireworks. The pilot immediately pulled up and banked hard to the right, barely avoiding the concentrated fire. Several rounds struck the aircraft's fuselage, and Maria could see smoke trailing from one of the engines. Taking hits, Dragon Lead transmitted. I've got engine damage and wounded crew. Need immediate medical support for my gunner. The situation had just become exponentially more complicated. Not only were the Rangers trapped and running out of ammunition, but now the extraction helicopters were damaged and potentially unable to complete the mission. Maria was the only person in position to change the tactical situation, but she was running out of time and ammunition. Through her scope, she studied the remaining machine gun positions with renewed intensity. The western position was the most protected, with the gunner operating from deep inside a natural cave in the rock face. The only way to reach him would be to somehow ricochet a shot off the cave wall or find an angle that she hadn't considered before. The southern position was slightly more vulnerable, but the gunner had learned from watching his comrades die. He was staying well back from the opening, only exposing the muzzle of his weapon when he fired. Maria would need to anticipate exactly when he would appear and be ready to take the shot instantly. She decided to focus on the southern position first, since it posed the greatest threat to the landing zone. Maria adjusted her position slightly, moving to a narrow ledge that gave her a better angle on the machine gun nest. The range was just over 700 meters, and she would be shooting at a steep downward angle. Through her scope, she could see the muzzle flash each time the PCM fired. The gunner was maintaining a steady rate of fire, sending bursts toward both the Rangers and the circling helicopters. If Maria could time her shot to coincide with his next firing sequence, she might catch him when he was focused on his targets rather than watching for incoming sniper fire. She counted the intervals between bursts: 8 seconds, 7 seconds, 9 seconds. The gunner was maintaining an irregular pattern, probably to avoid presenting a predictable target. But there was still a rhythm to his fire that Maria could exploit. The Barrett was loaded and ready. Maria controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate and steadying her aim. Through her scope, she watched the machine gun position intently, waiting for the telltale muzzle flash that would signal her opportunity. The PKM fired again, sending a long burst toward the Ranger's position. Maria saw the muzzle flash and immediately shifted her crosshairs to where she estimated the gunner would be. She squeezed the trigger just as the enemy fighter leaned forward to adjust his aim. The .50 caliber round covered the distance in less than a second, striking the machine gunner in the upper torso. The massive bullet's kinetic energy was sufficient to penetrate his body armor and continue through his body, striking the rock wall behind him with enough force to send stone fragments flying like shrapnel. "Southern machine gun is down," Maria reported, already shifting her aim to the final position. One more to go. But as she lined up her shot on the western machine gun nest, Maria heard something that made her blood run cold. The distinctive whine of incoming mortars filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The Taliban forces had brought heavy weapons to the fight, and they were about to rain high-explosive death on everyone in the valley. Maria reached the rocky ledge just as the first extraction helicopter came into view, a black dot against the azure Afghan sky. The UH-60 Black Hawk was still several kilometers away, but already she could see it taking evasive action. Intelligence reports were coming through her radio about surface-to-air missile threats in the area, making the pilots understandably cautious about their approach. She quickly set up her firing position, using her backpack as a rest for the Barrett's bipod. The rifle's muzzle brake would help control the massive recoil from the .50 caliber rounds, but she still needed to brace herself properly to maintain accuracy. Through her scope, she could see the Taliban machine gun positions clearly for the first time. The enemy had chosen their positions well. The primary machine gun nest was built into a natural rock formation about 400 meters from the trapped Rangers. The gunner was protected by thick stone walls on 3 sides, with only a narrow firing port facing the village. Taking him out would require threading the needle, putting a round through an opening barely 2 feet wide. "Bravo 6, this is Viper 1, Maria transmitted, breaking radio protocol. "I'm in position to provide fire support. Can you mark enemy positions with smoke?" There was a stunned silence before Morrison's voice came back. "Viper 1, what's your location?" "Command has you listed as 12 clicks south of our position." "Negative, Bravo 6. I'm on the ridge overlooking your position from the west. I can take out those machine gun nests, but I need you to keep their heads down while I work." Morrison didn't question how she had gotten there or why she had disobeyed orders. In combat, results mattered more than regulations. Copy that, Viper 1. We're down to our last 100 rounds, but we'll do what we can. The primary threat is the PKM on the North Ridge. He's got us completely pinned down. Maria adjusted her scope, compensating for wind speed and the downward angle of her shot. The distance was 847 meters according to her laser rangefinder, well within the Barrett's capability but challenging enough to require perfect technique. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate through techniques learned during countless hours of training. The machine gunner was visible through her scope, his face partially obscured by the weapon's sight. He was young, probably no older than 20, with the lean build of someone who had spent his life in these mountains. For a moment, Maria felt the familiar weight of what she was about to do. Each shot she took represented a life ending, a family that would mourn, a future that would never unfold. But then, she heard the distinctive crack of an AK-47 round striking stone near the ranger's position, followed by a cry of pain. Someone had been hit. The moral complexity of war could wait. Right now, 12 American soldiers needed her to do her job. Maria squeezed the trigger with the practiced ease of someone who had made similar shots dozens of times before. The Barrett roared, sending a massive .50 caliber round downrange at over 2,800 feet per second. The recoil drove her shoulder backward, but she maintained her sight picture long enough to see the impact. The bullet struck the machine gunner's center mass, the massive round's kinetic energy lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the stone wall behind him. The PKM fell silent instantly, its deadly chatter replaced by the sound of brass casings hitting rock as Maria worked the rifle's bolt. Good hit. Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. North Ridge machine gun is down. Can you take out the one on the east side? Maria was already shifting her aim to the second position. This gunner had heard his comrade's weapon fall silent and was trying to locate the source of the incoming fire. He kept popping up from behind his stone barrier, scanning the western ridge where Maria was hidden. She waited patiently for him to expose himself again. Through her scope, she could see the extraction helicopters getting closer. The lead Black Hawk was less than 2 minutes out, but the pilot was clearly struggling with the decision to land in such a hot zone. Enemy fire was still coming from multiple positions, and one lucky RPG shot could turn the rescue helicopter into a flaming wreck. The second machine gunner made his mistake, rising up to get a better angle on the Rangers below. Maria's second shot took him in the upper chest, the massive round punching through his body armor like it was made of paper. The PKM toppled forward, its barrel pointing harmlessly at the ground. East Ridge is clear, she reported, already looking for her next target. Through her scope, she could see Taliban fighters running between positions, trying to reorganize their defense. Some were pointing toward her position on the western ridge, having finally figured out where the devastating fire was coming from. Viper 1, you've got multiple hostiles moving up the ridge toward your position, Morrison warned. Time to relocate. Maria was already moving, grabbing her rifle and pack. She had maybe 30 seconds before the first enemy fighters reached her position. The rocky terrain that had provided her with an excellent shooting position would now become a deadly maze if the Taliban managed to surround her. As she scrambled down the backside of the ridge, Maria could hear the distinctive whoosh of an RPG being fired. The rocket-propelled grenade struck the rocks where she had been lying moments before, sending shrapnel whistling through the air above her head. The Taliban fighters had gotten lucky with their first shot, but she didn't plan to give them a second chance. The extraction helicopters were now directly overhead, the lead Black Hawk beginning its descent toward the village. But the remaining enemy positions were still active, sending streams of tracer fire toward the approaching aircraft. The pilot was forced to pull up and circle, looking for a safe approach vector that didn't exist. This is Dragon Flight Lead. The pilot's voice came over the radio. I count multiple active firing positions around the landing zone. We can't put down until that area is secure. Maria found a new shooting position about 200 meters from her original spot, a narrow crevice between two large boulders that provided excellent concealment. Through her scope, she could see at least 4 more enemy positions that needed to be neutralized before the helicopters could land safely. The third machine gun nest was the most challenging shot yet. The gunner had learned from the fate of his comrades and was staying well behind cover, only exposing the muzzle of his weapon when he fired. Maria would have to wait for him to make a mistake, something that might not happen before the Rangers ran out of ammunition entirely. Taliban fighters were now moving through the village itself, using the maze of mud brick buildings to get closer to the Rangers' position. Morrison's men were forced to split their remaining ammunition between the advancing ground troops and the machine gun positions, a tactical nightmare that could only end one way. Bravo 6, how much ammo do you have left? Maria asked, though she already suspected the answer. We're down to about 50 rounds total, Morrison replied. 2 of my guys are completely out. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they overrun our position. The pressure was mounting, but Maria forced herself to remain calm. Panic was the enemy of precision, and precision was the only thing that would save those Rangers. She studied the remaining enemy positions through her scope, looking for any weakness she could exploit. The 4th machine gun position was built into the wall of an old compound, with the gunner firing through a window opening. The range was just over 600 meters, a relatively easy shot under normal circumstances. But the gunner was smart, only exposing himself for a few seconds at a time before ducking back behind the thick mud brick walls. Maria waited, controlling her breathing and keeping her crosshairs steady on the window opening. She had one chance to make this shot count. If she missed, the Rangers would be overrun before she could reload and reacquire the target. The machine gunner appeared in the window, his weapon chattering as he sent another burst toward the Rangers' position. Maria squeezed the trigger, feeling the Barrett's familiar recoil. Through her scope, she saw the massive .50 caliber round punch through the window frame and find its mark. The machine gun fell silent, its operator slumping forward over the weapon. But even as she celebrated the successful shot, Maria could see that she was running out of time. The Taliban fighters on the ground were getting closer to the Rangers' position, and there were still 2 active machine gun nests preventing the helicopters from landing. She needed to move faster, take bigger risks, if she was going to save those 12 men. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Hindu Kush Mountains as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted the scope on her Barrett M82A1 rifle. She had been lying motionless on the rocky outcrop for over 6 hours, watching the valley below through her high-powered optics. The .50 caliber weapon, weighing nearly 30 pounds, had become an extension of her body during her 3 tours in Afghanistan. Today, she was supposed to be providing overwatch for a routine patrol, but nothing about this day would prove routine. The radio crackled to life in her earpiece. All units, this is Falcon Base. We have a situation developing in Grid Square 77 Alpha. Ranger Team Bravo has made contact with a large enemy force and is requesting immediate extraction. Maria's blood ran cold. Grid Square 77 Alpha was 12 kilometers northeast of her position, deep in Taliban-controlled territory. She had studied every inch of that valley during mission briefings. It was a natural funnel, surrounded by high ridges that provided perfect cover for ambushes. Intelligence reports had indicated heavy insurgent activity in the area for weeks, but Command had deemed the mission too important to postpone. Ranger Team Bravo consisted of 12 elite soldiers who had been conducting a high-value target mission. Their objective was Ahmed Hassan, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition supply convoys. Hassan was believed to be hiding in a small village nestled in the valley, protected by an unknown number of fighters. What was supposed to be a quick capture-or-kill operation had turned into a nightmare. Through her scope, Maria could see the smoke rising from the valley in the distance. Even at this range, the sound of heavy gunfire echoed off the mountain walls like thunder. She quickly calculated the distance and wind conditions, her mind automatically running through the ballistics equations that had been drilled into her during sniper school. The shot would be at the very edge of her weapon's effective range, but it was possible. Falcon Base, this is Viper 1, Maria transmitted, using her designated call sign. I have visual on the contact area. Request permission to reposition for fire support. The response was immediate and firm. Negative, Viper 1. Your orders are to maintain overwatch on current patrol. Extraction birds are being scrambled for Ranger Team Bravo. Maria gritted her teeth in frustration. She could hear the increasing intensity of the firefight in the distance. Through her radio, she monitored the desperate communications from the trapped Rangers. Their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Team leader Captain James Morrison was coordinating their defense from behind a cluster of mud brick buildings, but enemy fire was coming from multiple directions. Falcon Base, this is Bravo 6, came Morrison's voice, strained but controlled. We are taking heavy fire from prepared positions. I count at least 40 enemy fighters with RPGs and heavy machine guns. Our ammo is running low, and we have 2 wounded. The extraction helicopters were still 20 minutes out, and that was assuming they could even land in the kill zone. Maria watched helplessly as tracer rounds streaked across the valley like deadly fireflies. The Rangers were completely pinned down, unable to move from their defensive positions without exposing themselves to devastating crossfire. As the minutes ticked by, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The Taliban fighters had clearly planned this ambush carefully. They had allowed the Rangers to enter the village and then triggered explosions that blocked both escape routes. Now they were systematically tightening the noose, moving closer under cover of concentrated fire. We need to break contact, Morrison radioed. But every time we try to move, they light us up from the ridges. Someone needs to take out those machine gun positions. Maria made a decision that would change the course of her military career. She quickly packed her gear and began moving toward the trapped Rangers, knowing that she was directly disobeying orders. Her commanding officer would court-martial her for abandoning her post, but she couldn't sit idle while 12 of America's finest soldiers died in a valley she could reach. The terrain was treacherous, consisting of loose shale and hidden crevices that could snap an ankle in seconds. Maria moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to navigate Afghanistan's unforgiving landscape. Her Barrett rifle was slung across her back, along with her pack containing ammunition, water, and medical supplies. As she descended toward the valley, Maria's mind raced through possible shooting positions. She needed elevation, concealment, and a clear field of fire into the enemy positions. More importantly, she needed to get close enough to make her shots count. The Barrett was devastatingly accurate at long range, but precision became exponentially more difficult as distance increased. The radio chatter from the trapped Rangers became increasingly frantic. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the Taliban fighters were preparing for a final assault. Helicopter support was still 15 minutes away, but it was becoming clear that the Rangers didn't have 15 minutes. This is Bravo 6, Morrison transmitted, his voice tight with controlled desperation. Enemy fighters are massing for a final push. We won't be able to hold them off much longer. Where are those birds? Bravo 6, this is Falcon Base, came the reply. Extraction is inbound, but the landing zone is too hot. You need to suppress those enemy positions so the birds can land. With what? Morrison shot back. We're down to our last magazines, and there are machine gun nests on 3 sides of us. Maria pushed herself harder, sliding down a steep embankment that brought her to within 800 meters of the village. Through her binoculars, she could see the muzzle flashes from the Taliban positions. They had set up interlocking fields of fire that made it impossible for the Rangers to move without being cut down. The enemy fighters were using Soviet-era PKM machine guns, weapons that could tear through body armor like paper. They had positioned them on the high ground surrounding the village, creating a deadly crossfire that trapped the Rangers in a killing box. Maria counted at least 6 machine gun positions, plus an unknown number of fighters with AK-47s and RPGs. As she studied the enemy positions, Maria began to formulate a plan. If she could take out the machine gunners systematically, starting with the ones that posed the greatest threat to the extraction helicopters, she might be able to create a window of opportunity. The Barrett's .50 caliber rounds could punch through the stone walls the enemy was using for cover, making their positions far less secure than they realized. But first, she needed to find the perfect shooting position. Maria spotted a rocky ledge about 600 meters from the village that would give her an elevated angle on most of the enemy positions. It was risky. Once she started firing, every Taliban fighter in the valley would be looking for her. But it was the Rangers' only hope. As she made her way toward the ledge, Maria could hear the distinctive whine of incoming helicopters in the distance. The extraction birds were approaching, but they wouldn't be able to land until someone silenced those machine guns. She was their only chance, and she knew it. The weight of 12 lives pressed down on her shoulders as she climbed toward her chosen position. In a few minutes, she would either save those Rangers or die trying. There was no middle ground in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where survival often came down to a single well-placed shot, and the courage to take it in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispers through every valley, and hope dies with the setting sun, a rescue mission hung by the thinnest of threads. 12 elite Rangers had been trapped behind enemy lines for 72 hours, their ammunition running low, their radio batteries dying, and their chances of survival dwindling with each passing minute. The extraction helicopters circled helplessly above, unable to land due to heavy enemy fire from hidden positions in the rocky terrain. Command had all but written them off. The mission was classified as extreme risk, military speak for a suicide run. No pilot wanted to fly into what intelligence called a hornet's nest of insurgent activity. The Taliban had turned the entire valley into a killing field, with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns positioned at every strategic point. Then, through the crackling static of the radio, came a voice that would change everything. It was calm, steady, and unmistakably female. She identified herself with a call sign that would become legend among Special Operations Forces. What happened next defied every rule of engagement, every tactical manual, and every assumption about what one person could accomplish in the face of impossible odds. This is the story of how a single sniper with a Barrett .50 caliber rifle turned a doomed extraction into one of the most successful rescue operations in modern military history. It's a story of courage, precision, and the kind of split-second decisions that separate heroes from statistics. But, most importantly, it's a story about how sometimes, when all hope seems lost, salvation comes from the most unexpected places.